There are some stories that stay with you long after the telling is done. This is one of them. So pull up a chair and let us tell you about a young woman named Lenora Fitch and what she found hidden in the walls of a dead man's mill on the edge of the Canadian Shield. She was 22 years old, and she had nothing but a canvas bag, a pair of cracked leather boots, and a draw knife her mentor had left her when he died. The draw knife was old. The handle was worn smooth on one side where his thumb had rested for 40 years. She had wrapped it in a piece of flannel and tucked it at the bottom of the bag, beneath her spare dress and the last of the hardtack, and she did not take it out until she needed it. She was not sentimental by nature, but she kept that tool the way some people keep a letter, not because it was useful, which it was, but because it was proof that someone had once believed she was worth teaching. His name had been Edmund Cray. He was a wheelwright by trade, a stubborn and particular man who had taken Lenora on as an apprentice when she was 15, and her mother had been 3 months in the ground. He had not done it out of charity. He had done it, he said, because she had the hands for it. Patient hands, he called them, hands that understood wood before the brain caught up. He taught her to read the grain of ash and birch, to shape a spoke so true it barely needed fitting, to feel the moment which joint was right not by measuring, but by listening. He died of a lung fever the winter she turned 21, and he left her the draw knife and a letter that said, simply, "You know more than you think you do. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." She had been living in his house on the edge of Hartwell, Ontario, a small settlement along the Madawaska River, on the strength of an arrangement she had understood to be permanent. Edmund had no children of his own. He had no surviving family that anyone in Hartwell knew of. And so when the spring thaw came the year after his death, Lenora had gone on working the shop, taking small repairs, keeping the tools clean, believing the life she had built there was hers. She had been wrong. His nephew arrived on a Tuesday in late October, 3 days before the first hard frost. His name was Roland Cray, and he had come from Kingston with a deed of title, a lawyer's letter, and the particular manner of a man who has spent his life being told that things belonged to him. He was perhaps 40, broad-shouldered, with a watch chain he touched too often, and a way of looking around the shop that made Lenora feel like a piece of furniture being assessed for resale. He gave her 1 week. She had tried to explain that she had been Edmund's apprentice for 7 years, that she kept the shop running, that there were orders outstanding, and customers who depended on her. Roland Cray listened to all of it the way a man listens to weather he cannot change. When she finished, he said, "I'm sure my uncle was very fond of you, but the property is mine." He offered her $8 and told her to take what was hers. $8 for 7 years. She stood in the middle of the shop where she had learned everything she knew, where the smell of fresh shavings and linseed oil had been the smell of every morning for most of her adult life, and she looked at the money in his hand, and she took it, not because it was fair, because there was nothing else to do, and she understood that. She walked out of Hartwell on the last day of October with the canvas bag on her back and the draw knife wrapped in its flannel and the $8 sewn into the hem of her coat. The maples along the road had already dropped most of their leaves. The sky was the color of old pewter. A farmer with a load of fence posts passed her on the road and did not stop, though she was clearly carrying everything she owned. She kept her eyes forward and her pace steady, and she did not look back at the settlement. If she had, she might not have been able to keep walking. She had no destination. That was the truth of it, and we think it's worth sitting with for a moment. Because 22 years old, alone with $8 and a draw knife and the winter coming on is not an adventure. It is a very particular kind of fear. The kind that doesn't announce itself all at once. It seeps in, the way cold seeps through worn leather. She walked north and east, following the river road because she knew it, and because it felt safer than the open country. On the second day, she reached a place called Carrow Crossing, which was barely a place at all. A mill, a feed store, a church, and a cluster of houses around a crossroads. She stopped at the feed store and asked if there was work to be had. The man behind the counter said there was not. She asked if anyone needed a wheelwright. He looked at her hands, then at her face, and said he didn't know of any woman doing that kind of work. She thanked him and left. On the third day it rained, a cold gray rain that soaked through her coat before noon. She found a barn that had been left open. Whether by accident or custom, she didn't know. And she spent the night in the loft with the smell of old hay and the sound of rain on the roof. And in the morning, the cold had settled in her chest like something with weight. The abandoned mill was 2 miles north of Carrow Crossing, set back from the river on a rise of ground, that gave it a clear view down the valley. She found it the morning of the fourth day, half by accident. She had gone down to the river to wash her face and fill her canteen, and when she looked up she saw the roofline through the bare trees. She almost didn't go up. What made her climb that hill, she could not have said. Curiosity, maybe. Desperation dressed up as curiosity. But she went, and what she found was a building that had been a grist mill. She could tell by the size of the wheel housing and the stone foundation, and had not been operating for at least a decade. The wheel was still there, seized with rust, half submerged in the river's edge. The door to the main building was warped shut but not locked. She put her shoulder to it and it gave. Inside was cold and dark, and full of the smell of old stone and mouse droppings, and something faintly mineral she couldn't identify. The millstones were still in place. The main floor had held up. The loft above was sound. She tested the ladder rungs, one by one, before she trusted her weight to them. There was a rusted iron stove in the corner with a length of pipe that still connected to the chimney, and when she checked the flue with a stick she'd broken off outside, it moved. She built a fire with wood from a pile stacked under an overhang behind the building. Someone had left it there years ago, and it was dry enough to catch. She made tea from the last of her provisions, and she sat on the floor with her back against the warm stone of the fireplace, and she thought, one night, just one night to get dry and think. She stayed 3 weeks. Not because she had given up on moving, because there was work to do, and she could not help herself when there was work to do. The mill had a problem she could fix. She saw it the second day, when she was exploring more carefully. The wheel housing had rotted on one side where water had pooled and never drained, and the shaft that connected the wheel to the millstones had worked loose from its housing. It was a carpenter's problem as much as a miller's problem, and she had the tools for it, even if only her draw knife and the small hand plane she'd also carried away from the shop. She started with what she had. She cut replacement timbers from a stand of ash she found at the edge of the mill property. Her hands knew what to do. They always had. She worked through the cold with her breath coming out in clouds, and the draw knife peeling long curls of pale wood that fell around her boots. And the work was hard and slow, and she had to stop when her hands went numb, which was often, and she had not solved the problem of food beyond what she could forage from the hedgerows, which in late October in eastern Ontario is not much. She was hungry for most of those 3 weeks. That is not a small thing, and we don't mean to gloss over it. Hunger in the cold is its own kind of adversary, and Lenora felt it every hour. But the work helped. The work always helps, when you know how to do something true and physical and necessary. It gives the mind somewhere to go that isn't the place where the fear lives. It was on a Tuesday in the second week. She had lost track of the date, but she counted the days that she found the room. She had been checking the foundation on the north side of the building, looking for the source of a damp she'd noticed on the interior wall, and she had moved a section of old shelving that had been bolted to the stone, and behind it she found a door. It was small, low enough that she had to duck to enter. The wood was black with age and fitted so tightly into its frame that she would have missed it if the shelving hadn't shifted. There was a latch, not a lock, and when she lifted it and pushed, the door swung inward without a sound. The hinges had been oiled, she realized, not recently, but within living memory. Inside was a room roughly 10 feet square. There was a lantern hanging from an iron hook, and when she shook it, it still had oil. She lit it with the matches she carried. The room came into view slowly, the way cold rooms do, walls of dressed stone, a packed earth floor, and along the far wall stacked in careful order, ledgers, not grain records, not mill accounts. She knew that before she opened the first one, from the way they had been stored, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with cord, stacked on a wooden shelf that had been raised off the floor. Someone had put these here with intention. Someone had wanted them to survive. She sat down on the earthen floor with the lantern between her knees, and she opened the first ledger. It took her some time to understand what she was reading. The entries were in 2 hands, one a careful copperplate, the other a cramped and hurried scrawl, and they were dated from 1873 to 1881. They were accounts, but not of grain or lumber. They were accounts of land. Specifically, they were accounts of land that had been surveyed, recorded, and sold twice. Once in the official township records, and once again privately, to a man whose name appeared on every 3rd page. The name was Aldous Crane. She had heard that name before. In Hartwell, in the feed store in Carrow Crossing, in the conversation of any settler family along the Madawaska. Aldous Crane was the land agent for the Crown Lands Department in that district, had been for 20 years. He was the man who determined which lots were available for settlement, what the survey prices were, and whose applications were approved. He was, by general understanding, a man of standing and probity. The ledgers said otherwise. What she held in her hands was evidence of a scheme that had been running for at least 8 years. Crane had been marking lots as surveyed and available for purchase, collecting the settlement fees from families, and then quietly reassigning the same lots to a holding company, listed in the ledgers only as the consortium, which then resold them at 3 and 4 times the price, leaving the original settlers with no legal title and no recourse. She found names in those pages she recognized. The Turvey family, who had cleared their land for 4 years before being told Tutultite was invalid. Old Mrs. Deckard, who had paid twice for the same 50 acres and lost both payments. Families who had built homes and barns and root cellars on land that was never legally theirs. She sat in that cold room for a long time. There was also a letter tucked inside the back cover of the last ledger. It was dated September 1881 and addressed to a man she did not recognize. The mill's owner, she assumed, and it said in the careful copperplate hand, "I have kept the record as you asked. I can no longer stay in this district without endangering myself. If anything happens to me, take these to the land registry in Renfrew. My name is Gerald Lorne. I was a clerk in the Crown Lands Office for 11 years. What is recorded here is true. Gerald Lorne." She had no way of knowing what had happened to him. Perhaps he had left, perhaps something worse. But he had kept the record, carefully and faithfully, for 8 years, and then he had hidden it in the one place he trusted, and apparently no one had found it for 15 years. Until now. You have to understand what Lenora Fitch did next, and what she did not do, because this is the part of the story that tells you who she was. She did not take the ledgers and disappear. She did not bring them to Aldous Crane's office as leverage for her own benefit, though she could have. $8 was not much, and she was cold and hungry, and it would have been a human thing to do. She sat with the ledgers for 2 days. She read them completely. She made notes in the margins of a scrap of paper she found in her bag. She built a list of every family named, every transaction recorded, every date and amount, and lot number. And then on the 3rd morning she wrapped the ledgers back in their oilcloth, put them in her canvas bag along with her notes, and she walked the 18 miles to Renfrew. It took her a day and a half. She arrived in Renfrew on a Thursday morning with mud on her boots, and her coat still damp from the creek crossing she'd had to make when the road bridge was iced over, and she went directly to the offices of the land registry. The man at the desk told her to wait. She waited. An older man came out, a registrar named Arthur Semmons, who had the look of someone who had seen a great deal of human difficulty and had learned not to be surprised by any of it. She put the ledgers on his desk and she told him what she had found, and where, and what she believed they contained. Arthur Semmons opened the first ledger. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then he opened the second, then the third. He looked up at her. "Where did you say you found these?" she told him again. He wrote it down. "And you came alone?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Miss Fitch, I would like you to wait in this office. I am going to send for the Crown Lands Inspector, and I am going to ask you to tell him exactly what you told me." "Can you do that?" She said she could. She sat in that office for 4 hours. She drank 3 cups of tea that Arthur Semmons' secretary brought her without being asked, and she ate a meat pie that the same secretary produced from somewhere without explanation, and she was grateful for both in a way she did not know how to express. When the Crown Lands Inspector arrived, a man named James Thorvald, who had traveled from Ottawa and arrived looking like he had done so very quickly. She told the story again from the beginning, clearly and in order, with her notes in her lap. James Thorvald asked her many questions. She answered all of them. Aldous Crane was removed from his position within the month. The investigation that followed took the better part of a year, but the outcome was this. The families named in Gerald Lorne's ledgers had their titles confirmed. The fees paid twice were, where possible, returned. The consortium, which turned out to involve 3 men in addition to Crane, including a notary in Pembroke and a former reeve of Renfrew County, was dissolved, its principals charged under the Dominion Lands Act. The Turvey family kept their farm. Miss Deckard got a letter from the Crown Lands Department confirming her title, and she framed it and hung it above the kitchen door, which is where it stayed for the rest of her life. We think Gerald Lorne would have been glad to know that. As for Lenora, the mill at Carrow Crossing became, for a time, a matter of some administrative interest. It had been Crown land, improperly alienated during the consortium's operations. When the title was eventually cleared, it was registered to a holding in the name of a man who had died without heirs. The settlement of the estate took 2 more years, and during those 2 years, the mill sat empty, and Lenora Fitch continued to repair it. She had the wheel, turning by spring. She rebuilt the shaft, housing from ash she milled herself, cutting the timbers with an axe she had traded 2 repaired wagon wheels for, fitting the joints the way Edmund Cray had taught her to fit joints. By feel, not by measure. When the water came rushing through the sluice for the first time, and the millstones began to turn, she stood in the middle of the floor, with her hands at her sides, and listened to the sound of the stone on stone, and the water, and the creak, the number. And she thought of him. She thought of his hands on that draw knife. She thought of the way he used to hold a piece of ash up to the light and look at it for a long time before he put the tool to it, as though he was asking the wood's permission. By the time the legal questions around the mill were settled, 3 families from Carrow Crossing, and 2 from further up the valley, had begun bringing their grain there for milling. There was a meeting of the community in the church hall on a Sunday in January. Lenora attended, still half expecting to be told the mill was someone else's business, and Arthur Semmons, who had come down from Renfrew for the occasion, explained that the Crown intended to offer the mill property to the community on a cooperative title, contingent on continued operation. He looked at Lenora when he said continued operation, and she understood what he meant. She was 23 years old. She had arrived at that mill with $8 and a draw knife. The cooperative was formally registered in February. Lenora Fitch was named the mill operator, with a wage and a share of the surplus. She put the draw knife on a shelf above the workbench in the mill's repair room. Not because she had stopped using it, but because she wanted to see it there every day. It reminded her of what she knew. It reminded her of the man who had taught her, and sometimes, on quiet mornings before the farmers arrived with their wagons, she would stand at the mill door with her tea and look out at the river, at the wheel turning steady in the current. And she would think about Gerald Lorne, who had kept his record in the dark for 8 years because he believed the truth was worth keeping. She had never met him. She did not know what had become of him after 1881, but she liked to think that somewhere, somehow, he knew his ledgers had done what he had meant them to do. There is a particular kind of courage that doesn't look like courage from the outside. It looks like stubbornness. It looks like a woman walking 18 miles in a damp coat to put a stack of old ledgers on a stranger's desk. It looks like keeping your notes in order and answering every question clearly, even when you are cold and hungry and not sure anyone is going to listen. It is quieter than the kind of courage that gets celebrated. But it changes things just the same. We think of Edmund Cray sometimes when we tell this story, a man who looked at a 15-year-old girl with no family and patient hands and thought, she is worth teaching. We wonder if he knew what he was setting in motion. Probably he didn't. That's usually how it works. So here is the question we'd like to leave you with, and we mean it genuinely. Is there someone in your life, a teacher, a neighbor, an older tradesperson, anyone, who gave you something that turned out to matter more than they knew? A skill, a tool, a piece of advice you didn't understand until years later? Tell us in the comments. We read them, everyone.